The courtroom fell silent, as if the walls themselves held their breath. All eyes were on the little boy standing nervously on the witness stand, his small hands clutching the edge of the wooden barrier. He scanned the room, his wide, tear-filled eyes locking onto the man in the defendant's chair. The tension in the air was suffocating, thick with the weight of justice and the uncertainty of truth. Then it happened. The boy raised a trembling finger, pointed straight at the defendant, and in a voice that shook with emotion but left no room for doubt, he uttered 5 words that sent shockwaves through the room. "That man hurt my mom." Gasps echoed like thunderclaps. The defendant froze, his expression a mask of forced calm that couldn't hide the flicker of panic in his eyes. The judge banged the gavel, calling for order, but it was no use. Chaos had taken over, and as the boy began to cry, everyone in the courtroom realized that this trial had just taken a turn no one had expected. It had started like any other day for Sarah Miller and her 8-year-old son, Joey. Sarah, a single mother, worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. Despite the struggles, she always made time for Joey, whose boundless energy and infectious laugh were the light of her life. They lived in a modest apartment in a quiet neighborhood, where everyone knew everyone. Joey loved to ride his bike after school, and Sarah always made sure to watch him from the porch. She'd sip her tea, smiling as he zipped up and down the street, waving to the neighbors. Life was simple, but it was theirs, and it was good. But good things sometimes take sharp, unexpected turns. One chilly November evening, as the streetlights began to flicker on, Sarah noticed a black car parked at the end of the block. It hadn't been there earlier, and the way it idled made her uneasy. Joey, oblivious to her concern, pedaled past it, waving to the man inside. The man waved back, but something about his smile made Sarah's stomach churn. The next day, the car was there again, and the day after that. Sarah's unease grew into full-blown fear when Joey mentioned the man had spoken to him. "He said I had a cool bike," Joey said innocently over dinner. Sarah decided to call the police. But by the time they arrived, the car was gone. The officers assured her they'd patrol the area, but Sarah could see the doubt in their eyes. To them, it was probably nothing more than a concerned mother being overly cautious. Sarah knew better. 1 week later, Sarah woke up in a hospital bed, her head pounding and her vision blurry. The last thing she remembered was taking out the trash. Joey had been in bed, and the street had been quiet. Then, out of nowhere, someone had grabbed her from behind. "Where's Joey?" she croaked, panic clawing at her throat. A nurse quickly calmed her, explaining that Joey was safe and with a neighbor. But Sarah's relief was short-lived. The nurse's hesitant tone hinted at something worse. "You were attacked, Mrs. Miller. The police are investigating." Sarah's heart sank. Who would do this? And why? The weeks that followed were a blur of police interviews and sleepless nights. Joey, once so full of life, became withdrawn and quiet. He refused to talk about what had happened, and Sarah didn't push him, afraid of causing more harm. Then came the arrest. The police had found evidence linking a man named Richard Caldwell to the attack. He was a local businessman with a spotless record, but the discovery of Sarah's purse in his car had been enough to take him into custody. Sarah attended every court session, her resolve fueled by the need to protect Joey and ensure justice was served. But as the trial dragged on, doubt crept in. Richard's defense team painted him as a victim of circumstance, claiming the evidence was planted and pointing to his impeccable reputation. It wasn't until the day Joey was called to testify that the scales tipped. Back in the courtroom, the chaos following Joey's revelation had subsided. The judge, visibly shaken, ordered a recess. Joey was escorted out, his tiny frame trembling with the weight of what he had just done. Sarah rushed to her son, pulling him into a protective hug. "You did so well, baby," she whispered, her voice cracking. But as she looked over Joey's shoulder at Richard, who now stared back with a cold, calculating expression, Sarah knew the fight was far from over. For every answer Joey had given, more questions had surfaced. What exactly had he seen that night? And what secrets was Richard still hiding? The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered. But finding it would take more courage than Sarah or Joey had ever imagined. And as the courtroom doors slammed shut behind them, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The moment they stepped out of the courthouse, Sarah felt a suffocating wave of dread. Joey clung tightly to her hand, his knuckles white. The cameras flashing in their faces were relentless, reporters shouting questions that cut through the cold air like knives. "Mrs. Miller, what's your next move?" "Joey, what made you point him out? Do you believe Richard Caldwell is guilty?" Sarah shielded Joey as best she could, whispering soft reassurances. "Just keep walking, sweetheart. Almost there." Their lawyer, Mr. Tomlin, hurried them to a waiting car, slamming the door shut once they were safely inside. The muffled chaos of the crowd faded as the driver pulled away, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "You did great today," Mr. Tomlin said, attempting a smile. Joey's testimony was powerful. "It's going to make a difference." Joey stared out the window, silent. Sarah reached over, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "You okay, honey?" His voice was barely audible. "I'm tired." Sarah's heart ached. She had wanted to shield him from all of this, but now, her little boy was at the center of a storm neither of them had asked for. That evening, Sarah sat on the couch, flipping aimlessly through the channels. Joey had fallen asleep in her lap, clutching his favorite stuffed bear. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that made her uneasy. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number lit up the screen. "You're making a mistake. Drop this or you'll regret it." Sarah's blood ran cold. She stared at the message, her fingers trembling. Who could this be? Was it connected to the case? She thought about calling the police but hesitated. What would she even say? That she had received a vague threat from an untraceable number? It felt futile. Instead, she locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and kept Joey close. The next day, Sarah took Joey to his therapist, Dr. Alice Graham, a kind woman with a soft voice and a room full of toys. Dr. Graham had been working with Joey since the attack, helping him process the trauma. Sarah sat in the waiting room, flipping through an old magazine, but her mind was elsewhere. The courtroom replayed in her head. Joey pointing to Richard, the gasps, the look of shock on Richard's face. But there was something else, something she couldn't put her finger on. A flicker of emotion in Richard's eyes. Was it fear? Guilt? Or something more sinister? Her thoughts were interrupted when Dr. Graham appeared, smiling gently. "Joey's doing well," she said. "He's still processing everything, but he opened up a bit more today." Sarah forced a smile. "That's good to hear." Dr. Graham hesitated. "He mentioned seeing someone watching your house. Has he told you about that?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "No, he hasn't." "You might want to keep an eye out," Dr. Graham said, her tone cautious. "It could be nothing, but given everything that's happened, it's better to be safe." Sarah nodded, her mind racing. Was someone really watching them? Or was Joey's imagination running wild after all he'd been through? That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, listening to the creaks and groans of the old house. Every sound made her jump, her eyes darting to the shadows in the corners of the room. Around midnight, a noise outside caught her attention. She froze, straining to listen. It was faint at first, but then she heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, just outside the window. Her pulse quickened. She reached for her phone, dialing 911 with shaky fingers. As the operator answered, she whispered, "Someone's outside my house." The minutes felt like hours as she waited for the police to arrive. She peeked through the curtains but saw nothing. When the patrol car finally pulled up, the officers did a sweep of the property and found no one. "Could have been an animal," one of them suggested, though his tone was doubtful. Sarah wasn't convinced. The next day in court, the atmosphere was even more tense than before. Richard's defense team was in full attack mode, questioning the validity of Joey's testimony. "Isn't it possible," the defense attorney argued, "that Joey, being a young and impressionable child, might have been coached by his mother?" Sarah's stomach churned as the accusation hung in the air. She wanted to shout, to defend herself and her son, but she knew better than to let her emotions take over. Mr. Tomlin stood, his voice steady and calm. "Objection. That's pure speculation." The judge nodded. Sustained. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Sarah could see it in the jurors' faces, their uncertainty growing like weeds. And then, just as the session was about to end, a new witness was called to the stand. The courtroom doors creaked open, and a man walked in. He was tall, with sharp features and an air of confidence that immediately commanded attention. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She recognized him. It was the man from the black car. He took the stand, raising his right hand to swear the oath, and then turned to face the room. His eyes landed on Sarah, and a chilling smile spread across his face. "I'm here to tell the truth," he said, his voice smooth and unsettling. The room buzzed with whispers. Who was he? And what truth did he have to share? Sarah felt Joey's small hand slip into hers, and she gripped it tightly, her heart pounding. Whatever was coming next, she knew it would change everything. The man from the black car leaned forward, his hands resting on the wooden stand. His name, David Larson, was announced by the clerk, sending ripples of murmurs through the courtroom. His confident demeanor didn't waver as he gazed across the room, making a deliberate pause when his eyes met Sarah's. The prosecutor approached, clearly caught off guard. "Mr. Larson, could you explain your relationship to the defendant, Mr. Caldwell?" David smirked, tilting his head. "Relationship? I wouldn't call it that. I've known Richard for years. We've worked together on certain business ventures." "What sort of ventures?" "Oh, you know," David said nonchalantly. "Projects that don't exactly make it onto tax forms." The tension in the courtroom skyrocketed. Sarah's breath quickened as David's words sunk in. He was implicating Richard in illegal activities. But why now? What was his angle? As David's testimony unfolded, the courtroom hung on his every word. He recounted suspicious dealings between Richard and a network of unnamed individuals, painting a picture of a man deeply involved in illicit trades. When asked why he was testifying, David's response was chilling. "Let's just say Richard and I had a falling out. He's not as loyal as he pretends to be." "Are you suggesting Mr. Caldwell was involved in the attack on Mrs. Miller?" the prosecutor asked. David's eyes flickered to Sarah, his smirk vanishing. "I don't suggest anything, but if Richard wanted to intimidate someone or send a message, he wouldn't hesitate to do whatever it took." The room erupted in whispers, and the judge had to bang the gavel several times to restore order. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that David wasn't telling the whole story. There was something unsettling about him, something more dangerous than Richard's cold calculation. She glanced at Joey, who was drawing circles on his notepad, oblivious to the storm brewing around them. When court adjourned for the day, Sarah hurried to gather her things, eager to get Joey home. As they stepped outside, David was waiting near the courthouse steps. He lit a cigarette, his eyes locked on Sarah as she walked past. "Mrs. Miller," he called out, his voice smooth but with an edge that made her skin crawl. She froze, pulling Joey closer. "What do you want?" He took a long drag, exhaling the smoke lazily. "Just thought you'd like to know. You're poking a very dangerous bear. Be careful who you trust." "Is that a threat?" she snapped, her voice louder than she intended. David laughed, the sound low and menacing. "Just friendly advice." He turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Sarah shaken. Back home, Sarah double-checked the locks on the doors and windows. Joey, sensing her unease, climbed onto the couch beside her, resting his head on her shoulder. "Are we in trouble, Mom?" he asked, his voice small. Sarah kissed the top of his head, swallowing the lump in her throat. "No, baby. We're going to be okay." But deep down, she wasn't so sure. The following morning, Sarah woke to find an envelope slipped under the front door. Her name was scrawled across it in neat handwriting. She hesitated before opening it, her heart pounding. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message that sent chills down her spine. "You're digging too deep. Stop now, or you'll regret it." Sarah sat down, gripping the note tightly. This wasn't the first warning, but it was the most direct. She had no doubt it was connected to either Richard or David, or both. But giving up wasn't an option. Not now, not ever. She called Mr. Tomlin and informed him about the note. "This is getting out of hand," she said, her voice trembling. "Joey and I aren't safe. Bring the note to me," Mr. Tomlin said firmly. "I'll file it with the police. They need to know about this." Sarah agreed, but fear gripped her as she hung up the phone. Would the police really be able to protect them? At the next court session, David was called back to the stand. This time, he seemed less smug, his answers more clipped. It was clear that the prosecution was digging deeper, and David wasn't comfortable with where it was headed. "Mr. Larson," the prosecutor asked, "you mentioned earlier that Mr. Caldwell might do whatever it takes to intimidate someone. Do you have direct knowledge of him orchestrating the attack on Mrs. Miller?" David hesitated, a rare crack in his confident facade. "I don't have proof," he said slowly, "but I know how he operates. And yet you worked with him for years. Why should the court trust you now?" David leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Because I've got nothing to lose." The courtroom buzzed again, and Sarah felt the hairs on her arms stand on end. David's words felt like more than a declaration. They felt like a warning. As the day's proceedings wrapped up, the prosecutor hinted at introducing new evidence. Sarah's heart leapt at the possibility. Could this be the breakthrough they needed? But before she could dwell on it, something happened that sent the courtroom spiraling into chaos again. As Richard was being escorted out by the bailiff, he stopped abruptly and turned to face Sarah. His expression was calm, but his words were anything but. "You think you're safe," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "But you're not. None of you are." Gasps erupted as the bailiff pulled him away, but Sarah was frozen in place, her heart pounding in her ears. Joey tugged at her sleeve, his voice trembling. "Mom, what did he mean?" She didn't have an answer, but as she walked out of the courtroom, clutching Joey's hand tightly, she knew one thing for certain. The danger was far from over. The ride home from the courthouse was suffocatingly silent. Joey sat in the back seat, his eyes glued to the passing scenery. Sarah stole glances at him through the rearview mirror, her mind racing with Richard's parting words. "You think you're safe, but you're not." The threat clung to her like a dark cloud, making every shadow on the sidewalk seem sinister. That evening, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, staring at the crumpled note she had received. Beside it, a list of questions she couldn't answer. Asterisk, who slipped the note under the door? Asterisk, why had David suddenly turned on Richard? Asterisk, was there someone else involved they hadn't uncovered yet? Joey was upstairs in his room, playing with his Legos. His laughter occasionally floated down the stairs, a fragile reminder of the innocence she was desperate to protect. Her phone buzzed. It was Mr. Tomlin. "I've got news," he said without preamble. "The prosecution has surveillance footage they plan to introduce tomorrow. It might confirm Joey's testimony." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Footage of what?" "Of Richard Caldwell near your neighborhood the night you were attacked." She leaned back in her chair, a mix of relief and apprehension washing over her. "That's good, isn't it?" "It could be a game changer," Tomlin admitted, "but we need to prepare. If Richard feels cornered, there's no telling how he'll react." His words lingered long after the call ended. Late that night, Sarah woke with a start. A loud noise had jolted her from sleep, a sharp, metallic clatter, like a trash can being knocked over. She grabbed her phone and crept to Joey's room. He was fast asleep, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Relieved, she tiptoed to the window and peeked out. Her stomach dropped. A figure was moving near the edge of their yard. The shadowy outline was too far to identify, but it was unmistakably a person. She dialed 911, whispering her location and the situation. The dispatcher assured her that officers were on the way, but Sarah felt every second stretch into eternity. The figure moved closer, stepping into the faint glow of the porch light. For a moment, Sarah thought she recognized him, David Larson. But then he turned, disappearing into the darkness before she could confirm it. When the police arrived, they did another sweep of the property and, once again, found nothing. Sarah's frustration boiled over. "This isn't just in my head," she snapped. "Someone was out there. My son and I are being threatened, and I need you to take this seriously." The officers assured her they would increase patrols in the area, but their half-hearted promises only added to her growing sense of helplessness. The next morning, Joey hesitated at the breakfast table, his spoon circling his cereal. "Mom," he said quietly, "do you think that bad man is going to hurt us?" Sarah knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his. "No one is going to hurt us, Joey. I promise." But you're scared, he whispered, looking at her with wide, knowing eyes. Her chest tightened. It's okay to be scared, but we're stronger than the bad people. And we're not alone. Mr. Tomlin, the police, they're helping us. Joey nodded, though his worry didn't fade. In court that day, the atmosphere was electric. The prosecution unveiled the surveillance footage, showing a black car circling Sarah's neighborhood on the night of the attack. It was Richard's car. Gasps rippled through the room, and Sarah felt a surge of vindication. But the victory was short-lived. The defense immediately countered, claiming the footage was inconclusive. Simply driving through a neighborhood doesn't prove intent, Richard's attorney argued. Mr. Caldwell has associates all over the city. He could have been visiting a friend. The prosecutor pressed on, introducing time-stamped photos of Richard's car parked just a block away from Sarah's home. The defense shifted uneasily, their confident facade beginning to crack. During the recess, Sarah stepped outside for some air. Joey stayed inside with Mr. Tomlin, playing on his tablet. She leaned against the wall, closing her eyes and trying to steady her racing thoughts. Big day in there, a voice said. Her eyes snapped open. David stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. What do you want? She asked, her voice sharper than she intended. To help, he said with a smirk. Though you don't seem too grateful. Help, she scoffed. You're playing both sides. Why should I trust anything you say? David stepped closer, lowering his voice. Because I know what Richard is capable of. And you don't. Then why won't you tell the court everything? His smirk faded. Some truths come with a price. A price you're not ready to pay. Before she could respond, the bailiff called everyone back into the courtroom. David tipped his imaginary hat and disappeared into the crowd. The afternoon session was tense. The prosecution continued to pile evidence against Richard, painting a damning picture. But just as it seemed the scales were tipping in Sarah's favor, Richard's attorney dropped a bombshell. Your Honor, he said, rising from his seat, we have a new witness who can provide an alibi for my client on the night in question. The room fell silent as a woman walked in. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was someone she hadn't seen in years. Her sister. The courtroom erupted into chaos, questions and accusations flying as the judge struggled to regain control. Sarah's mind raced. What was her sister doing here? They hadn't spoken in over a decade, and now, of all times, she was siding with Richard? Joey tugged at her sleeve. Mom, who's that? Sarah couldn't answer. Because the truth was, she didn't know. Sarah's stomach churned as her sister, Melissa, took the stand. She gripped the edge of her seat, barely able to breathe. How could Melissa, who had abandoned their family years ago, suddenly reappear? And on Richard's side, Melissa swore the oath, her eyes darting nervously around the courtroom. When Richard's attorney approached, his tone was smooth and practiced. Miss Jensen, he began, can you state your relationship to Sarah Miller? Melissa glanced at Sarah, but quickly looked away. She's my sister. And can you explain why you've come forward today? I wanted to tell the truth, Melissa said, her voice trembling. The prosecutor stood abruptly. Objection, Your Honor. We have no record of this witness. Her appearance is a clear ambush. The judge frowned, then turned to the defense. Explain. We only located Miss Jensen last night, Your Honor, Richard's attorney replied. Given the urgency of her testimony, we decided it was critical to bring her forward immediately. The judge hesitated, then sighed. I'll allow it, but tread carefully. Melissa's testimony began, and every word felt like a knife twisting in Sarah's chest. I was with Richard the night of the attack, Melissa said, her voice steadier now. We were having dinner at a restaurant downtown. The defense attorney nodded. And how long were you with him? All night, Melissa replied. He couldn't have been anywhere near Sarah's house. Gasps filled the courtroom, and Sarah's grip on her seat tightened. The prosecutor stood. Miss Jensen, do you have any proof of this supposed dinner? Receipts? Witnesses? Anything? Melissa hesitated, her composure cracking. No, but... Then your testimony is hearsay, the prosecutor said firmly. Without evidence, it holds no weight. But the damage was done. The jurors exchanged uncertain glances, their confidence in the case clearly shaken. When the session ended, Sarah confronted Melissa in the hallway. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice low but fierce. Melissa avoided her gaze. "I'm trying to help." "Help? By lying for a man who attacked me?" "I'm not lying," Melissa snapped, finally looking at her. "I don't know what happened to you, but Richard isn't the monster you're making him out to be." Sarah stared at her, incredulous. "Why are you defending him? What does he have on you?" Melissa flinched but didn't answer. Joey appeared at Sarah's side, clutching her hand. "Mom, can we go home?" Sarah nodded, her anger simmering. "This isn't over," she told Melissa before walking away. That night, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her thoughts a tangled mess. Joey was asleep upstairs, and the house was eerily quiet. She couldn't wrap her head around Melissa's sudden reappearance. The sound of her phone buzzing broke her concentration. She picked it up and saw a message from an unknown number. "You can't trust your sister. She's hiding something." Sarah's blood ran cold. She stared at the message, her mind racing. Who was sending these texts? And how did they know so much? The next morning, Sarah decided to visit Melissa. She couldn't let her sister's betrayal fester without confronting it head-on. Joey stayed with their neighbor, Mrs. Allen, who was more than happy to babysit. Melissa lived in a rundown apartment on the edge of town. When she opened the door, she looked startled to see Sarah. "What are you doing here?" Melissa asked, her tone defensive. "We need to talk," Sarah said, pushing past her into the apartment. The place was cluttered and dimly lit, a stark contrast to the polished image Melissa had presented in court. "Why are you really doing this?" Sarah demanded. "Are you being paid? Threatened?" Melissa sighed, running a hand through her hair. "You wouldn't understand. Try me." For a moment, Melissa seemed to consider it. Then she shook her head. "It's better if you don't know." "Better for who?" Sarah shot back. Before Melissa could respond, a loud knock came at the door. "Were you expecting someone?" Sarah asked, her voice tense. Melissa shook her head, her face pale. The knock came again, harder this time. Sarah's instincts kicked in. "Don't answer it," she whispered. But Melissa ignored her, moving toward the door. As she turned the knob, the door burst open, slamming against the wall. A man in a black hoodie stepped inside, his face obscured by the shadows. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low and menacing. Sarah stepped in front of Melissa, her heart pounding. "Who are you? What do you want?" The man ignored her, his focus solely on Melissa. "You're supposed to stay quiet." "That was the deal." "I didn't say anything," Melissa protested, her voice trembling. "Not yet," the man said, pulling a gun from his pocket. Sarah's blood ran cold. "Don't do this," she said, her voice shaking. "There's a kid involved. Please." The man hesitated, his grip on the gun faltering. That split second was all Sarah needed. She grabbed a lamp from the table and swung it with all her strength, hitting the man's arm. The gun clattered to the floor, and Melissa screamed. "Run!" Sarah shouted, grabbing her sister's hand. They bolted out the door, their hearts pounding as they fled into the night. By the time they reached safety, both women were shaking. Melissa collapsed onto a bench, tears streaming down her face. "Who was that?" Sarah demanded. Melissa buried her face in her hands. "Someone I never should have trusted." "Start talking," Sarah said, her voice firm. "What's really going on?" Melissa looked up, her eyes filled with guilt. "I didn't want to drag you into this, but Richard isn't the only one you need to worry about." Sarah stared at her, her mind spinning. "What do you mean?" she asked. Melissa's next words sent a chill down her spine. "There's a whole network, Sarah, and they'll do anything to keep their secrets hidden." Sarah stared at Melissa, her mind racing to piece together the implications of her sister's words. "A network? Secrets?" She leaned forward, her voice trembling with urgency. "What do you mean, a network? Who are they?" Melissa wiped her face, avoiding Sarah's gaze. "It's bigger than Richard. He's just a cog in the machine. The people he works with? They have connections everywhere. Judges, police, even government officials. They're untouchable." Sarah's stomach turned. "Untouchable? You just said they sent someone after you." That doesn't sound untouchable. It sounds desperate. They are, Melissa admitted. Desperate to keep their empire intact. If I talked, if the truth came out, it wouldn't just ruin Richard. It would expose them all. Sarah's voice rose. So why are you protecting them? You're siding with the people who hurt me, who hurt Joey. Melissa flinched, guilt flashing across her face. I didn't have a choice, she said quietly. They threatened me, Sarah. They said if I didn't testify for Richard, they'd kill me. They'd kill you. Sarah sank onto the bench beside her sister, trying to steady her breathing. This wasn't just about Richard anymore. It was about a hidden web of power and corruption. And now, her family was caught in the middle. I need names, Sarah said finally. If we're going to fight this, I need to know who we're up against. Melissa shook her head, panic in her eyes. No, I've already said too much. They're probably watching us right now. Then why tell me any of this? Sarah pressed. If you didn't want my help, why say anything at all? Melissa's shoulders slumped. Because you deserve to know what you're walking into. I didn't want you blindsided when they come after you. Sarah didn't sleep that night. Back home, she locked every door and window, keeping Joey close. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from Mr. Tomlin and the police, who were now aware of the attack at Melissa's apartment. Joey noticed her unease. Mom, is Aunt Melissa in trouble? He asked. Sarah hesitated. She's figuring some things out. But we're safe, Joey. That's what matters. Joey didn't look convinced, but he didn't press further. The next day in court, the atmosphere was charged with tension. The defense was clearly rattled, their usual confidence replaced with unease. Melissa's sudden disappearance had thrown a wrench into their plans, and Sarah couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. But that hope was short-lived. The defense called their next witness, and the courtroom doors opened to reveal a tall man in a suit, his face calm and composed. Sarah's heart sank. She recognized him from Melissa's vague descriptions, a man she only knew as Mr. Harrington. State your name for the record, the judge instructed. James Harrington, the man said, his voice steady. Sarah gripped the edge of her seat, her mind racing. This was one of them, someone from the network Melissa had mentioned. The prosecutor didn't seem to know how to approach Harrington, which only made Sarah's anxiety grow. Mr. Harrington, the defense attorney began. Can you speak to the nature of your relationship with Mr. Caldwell? Certainly, Harrington replied smoothly. Richard is a close colleague. I've known him for over a decade, and I can vouch for his integrity. And on the night of the alleged incident, where was Mr. Caldwell? Harrington's eyes flickered to Sarah, a faint smirk playing at his lips. He was at a private event with me. A fundraiser. I have photos, emails, and several witnesses to confirm it. The courtroom buzzed as Harrington produced the evidence. Sarah's stomach twisted. The alibi seemed airtight, but something about Harrington's polished demeanor made her skin crawl. When court adjourned, Sarah found herself face-to-face with Harrington outside the building. Mrs. Miller, he said, his tone polite but cold. A pleasure to meet you. Sarah glared at him. What do you want? Harrington chuckled, adjusting his cufflinks. To offer you some advice. Drop this case. Walk away before it's too late. Or what? Sarah challenged. You'll come after me like you did Melissa? Harrington's smile never wavered. Melissa made her choices. You have a chance to make the right one. Think about Joey. He deserves a mother who's alive. His words hit like a punch to the gut. Stay away from my son, Sarah hissed. Harrington leaned in, lowering his voice. I don't need to go near him. Accidents happen all the time. Just a thought. With that, he walked away, leaving Sarah frozen in place, fury and fear warring inside her. That evening, Sarah met with Mr. Tomlin in his office, her hands trembling as she recounted Harrington's threat. This isn't just about Richard anymore, she said. There's a whole network behind him, and they're trying to silence me. Tomlin's face darkened. We'll take this to the police. And say what? That a man in a suit made a veiled threat? They won't do anything. Tomlin hesitated, then leaned forward. Then we hit them where it hurts. We dig deeper, find their weak spots and expose them. Sarah nodded, determination hardening in her chest. Later that night, as she tucked Joey into bed, Sarah made him a promise. No matter what happens, I'll always protect you, she said softly. Joey looked up at her, his eyes wide. Even from the scary people? Especially from them, she said, kissing his forehead. Just as she turned off the lights, her phone buzzed again. This time, the message was simple. Last warning. Sarah stared at the screen, her pulse racing. And then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of glass shattering downstairs. Her blood ran cold. Grabbing Joey, she whispered, "Stay close to me, no matter what." As they crept toward the stairs, Sarah's mind raced. Whoever had come into her house wasn't here by accident. This was personal, and she wasn't going down without a fight. Sarah tightened her grip on Joey's hand as the sound of footsteps echoed from downstairs. Each creak of the floorboards sent a jolt of fear through her body, but she knew she couldn't let it paralyze her. She needed to think clearly, for Joey's sake. "Stay quiet and follow me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. They tiptoed back into Joey's room. Sarah locked the door, then pushed his dresser against it. Joey's eyes were wide with fear, but he didn't make a sound. "What's happening, Mom?" he whispered. "Sure," she said, kneeling to his level. "We're going to be okay. Just stay here and don't move, no matter what you hear. Understand?" He nodded, tears pooling in his eyes. Sarah reached under his bed and pulled out the baseball bat she kept there. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. She kissed Joey's forehead and whispered, "I'll be right back." The hallway was dark, but Sarah knew the layout of her house like the back of her hand. She crept toward the stairs, holding her breath as she peeked around the corner. The living room light was on, casting eerie shadows across the walls. A figure was standing near the shattered window, rummaging through a drawer. It wasn't the man from Melissa's apartment. This intruder was taller, bulkier, and wearing a black ski mask. Sarah's heart pounded. She gripped the bat tighter, trying to steady her trembling hands. The intruder pulled something out of the drawer. Sarah couldn't see what, and slipped it into his pocket. He turned, scanning the room, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might leave. But then he started toward the stairs. Her pulse skyrocketed. She ducked into the hallway closet, holding her breath as the man's footsteps drew closer. The stairs creaked under his weight, and Sarah knew she didn't have much time. If he reached Joey's room, the thought was unbearable. When the man reached the top of the stairs, Sarah stepped out of the closet, raising the bat. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice cracking. The man froze, startled by her sudden appearance. But he quickly recovered, taking a step toward her. "Get out of my house," Sarah said, her voice firmer this time. The man didn't respond. Instead, he lunged at her. Sarah swung the bat with all her strength, striking him in the shoulder. He stumbled back, grunting in pain, but didn't go down. He grabbed the bat, yanking it from her hands. Sarah backed away, her mind racing for another plan. But before the man could advance, a loud voice echoed through the house. "Police! Drop your weapon." Two officers burst into the hallway, their guns drawn. The intruder hesitated, then dropped the bat and raised his hands. Sarah sagged against the wall, relief flooding her body. One of the officers cuffed the man while the other approached Sarah. "Are you okay, ma'am?" he asked. She nodded, her voice shaky. "My son. He's in his room." The officer gestured to his partner. "Check the kid's room." Sarah rushed to Joey's door, pushing the dresser aside and flinging it open. Joey was huddled under his bed, clutching his stuffed bear. When he saw her, he scrambled out and threw his arms around her. "I heard yelling," he said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "It's okay now," Sarah said, holding him tightly. "The bad man's gone." As the police escorted the intruder out of the house, Sarah caught a glimpse of his face as they removed his ski mask. She didn't recognize him, but the cold, calculating look in his eyes sent a chill down her spine. "Who is he?" she asked one of the officers. "We don't know yet," the officer replied. "But we'll find out." The police stayed for hours, collecting evidence and taking statements. Sarah sat on the couch with Joey, her arms wrapped protectively around him. When Mr. Tomlin arrived, he immediately started asking questions. "Did he say anything? Do you know what he was looking for?" Sarah shook her head. "No, he didn't speak. but he was going through the drawers like he was looking for something specific. Tomlin frowned. Did you notice anything missing? Not yet, Sarah admitted, but I'll check once everything settles down. The next morning, Sarah began taking inventory of her belongings. It wasn't until she reached the drawer the intruder had been rifling through that she realized what was missing. Her heart sank. It was the note, the one Melissa had warned her about. Whoever had sent the intruder wasn't just trying to scare her. They were trying to cover their tracks. Sarah called Mr. Tomlin to tell him about the missing note. They're getting desperate, he said, which means we're closer to the truth than they want us to be. But what truth? Sarah asked. I still don't understand why we're being targeted. Because you're a threat, Tomlin said. You and Joey. His testimony, your persistence, it's exposing cracks in their system. And they're trying to seal those cracks before it all falls apart. That night, Sarah stayed up late, poring over everything she knew about Richard, Melissa, and the network. Every detail, every inconsistency. It all pointed to something bigger than she had imagined. And then, as she reviewed the surveillance footage from her neighborhood one more time, she noticed something she hadn't before. In the corner of the screen, barely visible, was another car. It wasn't Richard's. It was David Larson's. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Why was David there? And why hadn't he mentioned it? Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. A new message flashed on the screen. You're running out of time. Sarah stared at the words, her fear slowly giving way to determination. They wanted her to give up, to back down. But if there was one thing Sarah knew, it was this. She wasn't going to stop until she uncovered the truth, even if it cost her everything. Sarah stared at the message on her phone, her heart pounding. You're running out of time. The words seemed to taunt her, a chilling reminder of how deeply she and Joey were entangled in a web she hadn't asked to be a part of. But now, David's presence near her house on the night of the attack raised new questions. Was he truly the ally he pretended to be? Or had he been playing both sides all along? The next day, Sarah decided to confront David. She wasn't going to let him continue hiding behind his cryptic words and unsettling smirks. Joey was at school, and Sarah felt a pang of guilt for sending him back so soon after the break-in. But the police assured her that increased patrols would keep the area safe, and she knew he couldn't stay hidden forever. David was easy to find. He frequented a local coffee shop, the kind of place where people exchanged secrets under the hum of espresso machines. When Sarah walked in, he was sitting in a corner booth, sipping black coffee like he didn't have a care in the world. David, she said, sliding into the seat across from him. He raised an eyebrow, his smirk already forming. Sarah Miller. To what do I owe the pleasure? She leaned forward, her voice low but firm. You were at my house the night I was attacked. Why? His smirk faltered for a split second before returning. I have no idea what you're talking about. Don't play dumb, she snapped, pulling out her phone and showing him the footage. That's your car. What were you doing there? David leaned back, studying her with a mix of curiosity and annoyance. You're more observant than I gave you credit for. Answer the question, he sighed, setting his coffee down. Fine. I was keeping an eye on you. Why? Because I knew Richard was going to make a move, David said, his tone casual, as if they were discussing the weather. I wanted to see what he was up to. Why didn't you warn me? David shrugged. You wouldn't have believed me. And besides, I didn't think he'd go that far. Sarah's hands balled into fists. You're lying. You were there for a reason, and I'm not leaving until you tell me what it is. David's smirk disappeared. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. You really want to know? Yes. I was there because you're part of something bigger than you realize, he said, his voice cold and serious. Richard and his little cronies aren't the top of the food chain. They're pawns, just like you and me. David's words hung in the air like a fog. Sarah struggled to process what he was saying. Pawns? She repeated. In what? David chuckled darkly. A game of power and control. Money, influence, it all flows upward. The people Richard works for? They're not just rich. They're untouchable. And if they think you're a threat, they'll stop at nothing to take you out. Sarah's throat tightened. Then why are you helping them? Who said I was? David shot back. I'm playing my own game, Sarah. One that keeps me alive. And what about Joey? What about me? David's expression softened, but only slightly. That's why I've been feeding you breadcrumbs. To help you stay one step ahead. Sarah's frustration boiled over. Breadcrumbs? Like showing up in court just to drop cryptic hints? Or watching my house and doing nothing when Richard sent someone to attack me? David leaned in closer, his tone sharp. Do you think I enjoy this? I'm walking a tightrope, Sarah. If they even suspect I'm helping you, I'm dead. So don't act like you're the only one with something to lose. Sarah sat back, her mind racing. If David was telling the truth, he was in as much danger as she was. But that didn't make her trust him. What do you know about the network? She asked. David hesitated, glancing around the coffee shop as if checking for eavesdroppers. Then he leaned in again, his voice barely above a whisper. They're connected to everything: businesses, law enforcement, politics. They use people like Richard to do their dirty work. Blackmail, intimidation, even violence. It's all part of the system. Why target me? Sarah asked. I'm just a single mom trying to protect her son. You're not just anyone, David said. Joey saw something that night, something that could bring them down. They're trying to silence you before he can testify. Sarah's heart sank. Joey's testimony wasn't just about Richard anymore. It was a threat to the entire network. As she left the coffee shop, Sarah's mind was a whirlwind of questions. David's revelations had given her a glimpse into the shadowy forces at play, but they also left her feeling more vulnerable than ever. When she picked Joey up from school, he seemed quieter than usual. Are you okay, sweetheart? She asked as they walked to the car. Joey nodded, but his expression was troubled. What's wrong? There was a man watching me at recess, he said, his voice small. He was standing by the fence, just staring. Sarah's blood ran cold. What did he look like? Joey shrugged. He had sunglasses and a black jacket. I didn't see his face. That night, Sarah called Mr. Tomlin and told him everything. David's confession, the network, and the man Joey had seen. This is escalating, Tomlin said, his tone grim. We need to bring this to the FBI. Sarah hesitated. Will they even listen? They will if we present the right evidence, Tomlin said. But we need to move quickly. The longer we wait, the more dangerous this becomes. As Sarah hung up the phone, her resolve hardened. She wasn't going to let fear control her. She tucked Joey into bed, then sat at the kitchen table with her laptop, determined to piece together the clues David had given her. But just as she started typing, her phone buzzed again. Another message appeared on the screen. You should have walked away. Now it's too late. Before Sarah could react, the power in the house went out, plunging everything into darkness. And then she heard it, the sound of footsteps outside the window. This time, she knew they weren't alone. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, crunching the gravel outside her house. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides, amplifying every sound. She grabbed her phone, her fingers trembling as she tried to dial 911. Come on, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Before the call could connect, the phone slipped from her grasp, clattering to the floor. The sound was deafening in the silence. From outside, the footsteps stopped. Sarah's heart pounded in her ears as she dropped to her knees, fumbling for the phone. Her hands finally closed around it, but before she could move, a shadow passed by the window. She grabbed the baseball bat from the corner of the room, gripping it tightly. She couldn't panic, not now. The house was eerily silent. Sarah crept toward Joey's room, the bat raised, her senses on high alert. Joey was still asleep, his small frame buried under the blankets. She closed the door quietly and wedged a chair under the knob, creating a makeshift barricade. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of something on the floor, tiny shards of glass near the window. The window was open, just slightly. Her stomach lurched. Someone had been inside. Sarah rushed back into the hallway, her eyes darting to every corner. The intruder could still be in the house. She made her way toward the kitchen, where the back door was slightly ajar. The wind outside howled, pushing the door open a little wider. Sarah's grip on the bat tightened as she approached, her breath shallow. Then, Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a figure dart into the shadows. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice trembling. There was no answer. She stepped into the backyard, her eyes scanning the darkness. A rustling sound came from the bushes near the fence. She raised the bat, ready to swing. "Show yourself." Slowly, a man emerged from the shadows. He was tall, wearing a black jacket and sunglasses, just as Joey had described. Sarah's blood ran cold. "You should have listened," the man said, his voice calm but menacing. Before Sarah could respond, headlights flooded the backyard. A car screeched to a halt, and someone stepped out. "Sarah." It was David. The man in the black jacket turned to face him, his posture tense. "You're making a mistake," David said, his tone measured. "She's not your problem. Walk away while you still can." The intruder sneered. "You want to talk, Larson? Still playing both sides, huh?" David didn't flinch. "Let her go. She's not worth the trouble." The man hesitated, his gaze flicking between Sarah and David. Finally, he stepped back into the shadows. "This isn't over," he said before disappearing into the night. Sarah lowered the bat, her legs threatening to give out. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, glaring at David. "Saving your life," he said, walking toward her. "I don't need your help." "Yes, you do," David replied, his voice firm. "You're in way over your head, and now they know you're not going to back down." "Who was that?" "An enforcer," David said. "The kind they send when a warning doesn't work." Sarah's heart sank. "Joey, he's fine," David interrupted. "But you need to pack a bag. Now." "Why?" "Because they'll be back," David said, his tone urgent. "And next time, they won't leave empty-handed." Sarah didn't argue. She rushed inside, grabbing a duffel bag and filling it with essentials. Joey woke up during the commotion, rubbing his eyes as he sat up in bed. "Mom? What's going on?" "We're going on a little trip," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice calm. "Why?" "It's late." "Because it's safer this way," she said, pulling him into a hug. Joey didn't ask any more questions. They piled into David's car, the engine rumbling as he pulled out of the driveway. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked. "A safe house," David said. "Somewhere they can't find you." Sarah stared out the window, her mind racing. She didn't trust David, but at this point, she didn't have many options. "Why are you helping us?" she asked after a long silence. David didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it. "Because I know what it's like to be hunted." The safe house was a small cabin deep in the woods, far from the city. The air was cold, and the darkness outside felt impenetrable. David unlocked the door and gestured for them to go inside. "It's not much," he said, "but it's secure." Sarah set her bag down, her body aching with exhaustion. Joey curled up on the couch, clutching his stuffed bear. David stood by the window, peering out into the night. "They won't stop, will they?" Sarah asked, breaking the silence. David shook his head. "Not until they get what they want." "And what is that?" David turned to her, his expression grim. "They want to erase the threat. And right now, that's you and Joey." Sarah's fear turned to anger. "Why? What could Joey possibly know that's so dangerous?" David hesitated, then sighed. "The attack wasn't random, Sarah. They needed leverage, something to keep you quiet. But Joey saw more than they expected. Something they didn't want anyone to see." Sarah's mind raced. What did he see? David's face darkened. "That's the question. And the answer could destroy them." The cabin fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. But before Sarah could ask another question, the sound of tires crunching gravel echoed outside. David grabbed his gun, his expression steely. "They found us," he said. Sarah pulled Joey closer, her heart pounding. This time, there was no running. They had to face whatever was coming head-on. The sound of tires on gravel drew closer, the low hum of an engine reverberating through the cabin. Sarah clutched Joey tightly, her heart racing as David stood by the window, gun in hand, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. "Stay back," he muttered, his voice tense. Sarah crouched behind the couch, pulling Joey close. His small hands clung to her, trembling. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. The engine cut off, plunging the cabin into an eerie silence. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Then came the sound of car doors opening and closing. Multiple people. David gestured toward the back of the cabin. There's a crawl space under the floor. Take Joey and hide. Now. What about you? Sarah asked, her voice shaking. David's jaw tightened. I'll buy you time. Go. Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed Joey's hand and ran to the back room. David had shown her the crawl space earlier, a narrow opening hidden under a loose floorboard. She pried it open and helped Joey climb down, following him just as the sound of heavy footsteps approached the front door. Through the slats in the floor, Sarah could hear muffled voices. David Larson. A man called out, his tone mocking. You've been a real pain. You know that? Funny, David replied, his voice calm but steely. I was going to say the same thing about you. The front door burst open, and boots stomped across the floor. Sarah counted at least 3 sets of footsteps. Joey huddled against her, his face buried in her chest as she held him tightly. Where are they, David? The man demanded. David chuckled. You think I'd make it that easy for you? The man's tone turned cold. You've got one chance to hand them over. After that, we're done playing nice. Sarah heard a shuffle, followed by the distinct click of a gun. Funny, David said. I was about to say the same thing. The cabin erupted in chaos. Gunshots rang out, echoing like thunder in the confined space. Sarah flinched, covering Joey's ears as dust rained down from the floorboards above. Stay down, David shouted. The sound of furniture overturning and men shouting filled the air. Sarah's heart raced as she clung to Joey, praying they wouldn't be discovered. A voice barked orders. Find them. Check every room. Heavy footsteps approached the back of the cabin. Sarah held her breath as the floorboards creaked above them. Joey's small frame trembled against hers, his tears soaking her shirt. One of the men's voices called out. They're not here. Keep looking. A loud crash came from the front room, followed by a pained yell. David's voice rang out. You're going to regret this. Another gunshot. Another scream. Then, silence. Sarah's chest tightened as the silence dragged on. She strained to hear any sign of David or the intruders, but all she could make out was the distant rustle of wind through the trees. Finally, footsteps approached the crawl space. Sarah tensed, her grip on Joey tightening. The floorboard above them shifted slightly, and for a moment, she thought they'd been found. But the footsteps moved away. A car engine roared to life, and the sound of tires peeling away followed. After several long minutes, Sarah carefully pushed the floorboard open and peeked out. The cabin was in shambles. Overturned furniture, bullet holes in the walls, and broken glass scattered across the floor. David was slumped against the wall, blood staining his shirt. David! Sarah scrambled out of the crawl space and rushed to his side. He groaned, his hand clutching his side. Told you. I'd buy you time. You're hurt, Sarah said, panic rising in her chest. It's not as bad as it looks, he muttered, though his pale face said otherwise. Joey climbed out of the crawl space, his eyes wide with fear. Is he going to be okay, Mom? Sarah forced a smile. He's going to be fine, Joey. David chuckled weakly. Kid's got a lot of questions. Sarah helped David to his feet, supporting him as they stumbled out of the cabin. The night air was cold and biting, but it felt like freedom after the suffocating chaos inside. We can't stay here, David said, his voice strained. No kidding, Sarah replied, glancing back at the destroyed cabin. David gestured toward his car, which was miraculously untouched. Get in. I'll drive. Sarah hesitated. You're in no condition to drive. I'll manage, David said, his tone leaving no room for argument. As they drove away from the cabin, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The men who had come for them weren't amateurs. They were part of something much bigger, something that wouldn't stop until it got what it wanted. Where are we going? She asked. David glanced at her, his face grim. To someone who can help. Someone who knows how to fight back. Who? You'll see, David said, his voice tinged with both hope and doubt. Joey leaned against Sarah, his eyelids drooping. Are we safe now, Mom? Sarah kissed his forehead, her voice soft but firm. "We will be, sweetheart. I promise." But deep down, she knew the road ahead was only going to get darker, and she wasn't sure how much longer they could keep running. The car sped down a winding road, headlights cutting through the darkness. The air was heavy with tension, each mile feeling like a fragile step away from danger. Joey had fallen asleep in Sarah's lap, his breathing steady, but Sarah couldn't relax. Her eyes darted to David, whose pale face was etched with pain as he gripped the steering wheel. "You need to tell me where we're going," Sarah said. David didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the road ahead. "David," she pressed, "if I'm putting my son's life in your hands, I need to know." He sighed. "We're going to see someone who used to be part of the network. Someone who knows how to fight them." "Used to be?" Sarah's voice was sharp with suspicion. "Why aren't they still involved?" "Because they tried to expose the truth," David said, "and barely survived it." An hour later, they arrived at a small, nondescript farmhouse nestled in the middle of nowhere. The faint glow of a porch light illuminated the property, but everything else was swallowed by the night. David pulled the car to a stop, exhaling shakily. "Stay close to me," he said, glancing at Sarah and Joey. Sarah hesitated. "Are you sure about this?" "No," David admitted, "but we don't have a choice." They approached the front door, and David knocked twice. A long pause followed, the silence stretching uncomfortably. Sarah shifted nervously, glancing back at the car, wondering if they should leave. Finally, the door creaked open, revealing a tall woman in her 50s with sharp features and piercing blue eyes. She wore a flannel shirt and jeans, but her demeanor was anything but casual. Her eyes flicked to David, then to Sarah and Joey. "David Larson," the woman said, her tone flat. "Haven't seen you in years. Thought you were dead." "Not yet," David said with a faint smirk. The woman's gaze narrowed. "And now you've brought company. Why?" "Because they're in the same mess you got out of," David replied. The woman sighed, stepping aside. "Come in." Quickly. Inside, the farmhouse was cozy but utilitarian. The furniture was minimal, and the walls were lined with shelves of books, maps, and scattered notes. Sarah could tell this wasn't just a home. It was a hideout. The woman gestured to the couch. "Sit." "Explain." Sarah settled Joey on the couch, his eyes wide as he looked around the room. David sank into a chair, wincing as he clutched his side. "This is Sarah and her son, Joey," David began. "They've been targeted by the network. The boy saw something during an attack on Sarah, and now they're trying to silence them." The woman's eyes darkened. "What did he see?" "We don't know yet," Sarah admitted. "Joey's been too scared to talk about it." The woman's sharp gaze softened as she looked at Joey. "Hey, kiddo," she said gently. "Do you remember what happened?" Joey hesitated, his small hands clutching Sarah's arm. "It's okay, sweetheart," Sarah whispered. "You can tell her." Joey took a shaky breath. "I saw a man," he said, his voice barely audible. "He had a big bag, and he was putting things in it from our house." "What kind of things?" the woman asked. Joey frowned, his brow furrowing. "Papers." "But then he saw me. He told another man that I couldn't talk, that I saw too much." Sarah's chest tightened. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "I was scared," Joey said, his voice breaking. The woman exchanged a look with David. "It sounds like he saw documents they didn't want getting out." David nodded. "Something incriminating." The woman leaned forward, her expression serious. "If they're after you this hard, it means you're a threat to their entire operation. They'll do whatever it takes to protect their secrets." "What do we do?" Sarah asked. The woman stood, pacing the room. "First, we need to figure out what's on those documents. If we can get our hands on a copy, we might have leverage." "And if we can't?" Sarah asked, dread creeping into her voice. "Then you and your son need to disappear," the woman said bluntly. "For good." The weight of her words hung in the air. Sarah looked at Joey, who was staring down at his lap, his small shoulders trembling. "I'm not running forever," Sarah said, her voice firm. "If these people think they can scare us into silence, they're wrong." The woman's lips twitched into a faint smile. "I like your spirit, but you need to understand what you're up against. This isn't a game." These people don't just want to scare you. They want to erase you. As the night wore on, the woman, whose name was revealed to be Evelyn, laid out a plan. She had contacts, people who had also escaped the network and could provide safe passage if things went south. But Evelyn's main focus was the documents. "Do you know anyone who might have a copy?" Evelyn asked. Sarah thought for a moment, then her eyes widened. "Melissa, my sister. She might have something. She knew too much but refused to tell me everything." Evelyn nodded. "We'll need to track her down," David groaned. "She won't make it easy. Last I heard, she's in hiding. She'll come out if she knows Joey's in danger," Sarah said. The group agreed to set out in the morning to locate Melissa. Evelyn's contacts would provide surveillance and assist in tracking her down. As Sarah lay on the couch that night, Joey curled up beside her. She couldn't help but feel the weight of what was to come. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about exposing the truth and ensuring her son would never have to live in fear again. But as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the network was already one step ahead. And this time, she wasn't sure they'd make it out alive. Morning broke with a cold, pale light that seemed to seep through every corner of the farmhouse. Sarah stood by the window, staring out at the frost-covered fields. Behind her, Evelyn spread a map across the table, marking key locations with a red pin. David sat nearby, pale and stiff. His hand resting on the wound he refused to let slow him down. Joey sat quietly at the kitchen table, drawing pictures of superheroes. His small hands moved across the paper, creating bold strokes of color that felt like a glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak situation. "We'll start here," Evelyn said, pointing to a small town 2 hours away. "If Melissa's still in hiding, she might have left traces. People like her always do. And if she doesn't want to be found?" Sarah asked. Evelyn looked up, her gaze steady. "Then we make her see she has no choice." The drive to the town was tense. Joey dozed off in the back seat, clutching his stuffed bear, while Sarah and David sat in silence. Evelyn drove with the precision of someone who had spent years evading pursuers. When they arrived, Evelyn directed them to a dingy motel on the outskirts of town. She handed Sarah a photograph of Melissa that she'd managed to pull from a database of known associates linked to the network. "Show this around," Evelyn instructed. "Ask questions, but don't draw attention." Sarah and David split up, searching local diners and shops for any sign of Melissa. Hours passed with no leads, and Sarah's frustration grew. Just as she was about to give up, she overheard two waitresses chatting at a corner table. "Did you see that woman in room 8? One asked. "Keeps to herself, but she's always watching the news like she's expecting to see her face on there." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Excuse me," she interrupted, holding out the photograph. "Is this her?" The waitress squinted at the photo. "Yeah, that's her. She's been staying here for weeks." Sarah and David returned to the motel, regrouping with Evelyn. They stood outside room 8, Sarah's heart pounding in her chest as she raised her fist to knock. The door opened a crack, and Melissa's face appeared, pale and drawn. Her eyes widened when she saw Sarah. "What are you doing here?" Melissa hissed, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to be watching. "We need your help," Sarah said. "It's about Joey and the network." Melissa hesitated, then opened the door fully. "Come inside." Quickly. The room was small and cluttered, with papers and photographs scattered across the bed and floor. Sarah immediately recognized some of the documents, blueprints, financial ledgers, and surveillance photos. "This is what they're after," Melissa said, gesturing to the chaos. "Proof of everything they've done. Corruption, blackmail, murder. It's all here." David stepped forward. "You knew this whole time and didn't say anything?" Melissa glared at him. "You think it's that simple? The moment I spoke up, they'd have killed me. I've been trying to find a way to expose them without putting myself, and Sarah, in more danger." "Well, congratulations," David said dryly. "They already know you have this, and they're coming for you." As if on cue, the sound of tires screeching outside sent everyone into a panic. Melissa rushed to the window, her face draining of color. "They're here," she whispered. Evelyn grabbed the papers, stuffing them into a duffel bag. "We need to go. Now." The group fled out the back door, sprinting toward a wooded area behind the motel. Shouts and the heavy thud of boots followed them, but Evelyn led them through the trees with the precision of someone who had done this before. They reached a clearing where an old van was parked. Evelyn had arranged for backup, 2 of her contacts, armed and ready. They piled into the van, and the driver floored it, leaving the motel and their pursuers behind. Back at the farmhouse, Evelyn scanned the documents, her expression grim. "This is it," she said. "This is everything we need to bring them down. But how do we get it to the right people?" Sarah asked. Evelyn smiled faintly. "I know exactly who to send this to. Whistleblowers, journalists, people they can't bribe or intimidate." David leaned back, his face pale but relieved. "It'll take time, but once this gets out, the network won't be able to hide." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Evelyn's contacts worked tirelessly to distribute the evidence, and soon the media exploded with reports of corruption and conspiracy. Arrests followed, starting with Richard Caldwell and spreading to the higher-ups in the network. Sarah and Joey stayed with Evelyn, who ensured their safety while the dust settled. For the first time in months, Sarah felt like she could breathe again. One evening, as they sat on the farmhouse porch, Joey looked up at his mom. "Are the bad people gone now?" Sarah smiled, pulling him close. "Most of them. And the rest? They're going to be too busy running to ever bother us again." Evelyn joined them, a rare smile on her face. "You did good, Sarah. You didn't give up." Sarah looked at Joey, then back at Evelyn. "I couldn't. Not for him." As the sun set over the fields, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Sarah finally allowed herself to hope. The battle had been long and terrifying, but they had won. And now, for the first time in what felt like forever, they could begin to heal.